Hi, everybody. Welcome to the AABA webinar series. Just a couple quick notes. We have allowed the chat function to be open for all attendees, and also you can put in any comments or questions in the Q&A portion. And we are recording this and putting this eventually on the AABA website. So with that, I will turn it over to Esther, and thank you all so much for being here.
Indeed, thank you all very much for being here at the ABA webinar series. And this one will be on open science in biological anthropology. And so before we go any further with open science, I would just like to introduce you to our moderators today, which are myself and Björn. So I'm a data steward at the Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands, and I did a PhD in isotope archaeology in the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. Also in the Netherlands, and I'm an open science community member. And I hope Björn can unmute himself to introduce himself.
Yeah, hi, my name is Bjorn, and I am also a data steward at TU Delft in the Netherlands. And I am almost a PhD in bioarchaeology. I'll be defending in May, and that's at Leiden University. And I started the archaeology community, which is not directly an open science thing, but it does deal with an open source statistical software, which is important for open science.
Indeed, and hopefully you can put a link to this in the chat. Great. And then before we go any further with open science, I think it's helpful to go over some definitions. So I'm the person that will take you through some definition slides, and then we get to the exciting part where we talk to our panelists. And so throughout this webinar, we refer to open science and we'll use the UNESCO definition of open science. And UNESCO defines open science as an inclusive construct that combines various movements and practices aiming to make multilingual scientific knowledge openly available, accessible, and reusable for everyone. And not only do they want to do that just to make it openly available, but with the aim to increase scientific collaboration and sharing of information for the benefits of society and science. So not just open for no reason, but for the benefits of science and society. And this definition goes further than just opening up of knowledge. It also wants to open up the processes of scientific knowledge creation, evaluation, and communication to societal actors beyond the traditional scientific community. And this opening up of the knowledge creation process actually ties in perfectly with another definition or a set of principles, which are called the CARE principles for Indigenous data governance. And this will be a very brief summary. I will in no way do justice to the work of Carol and colleagues. So please do look up the publication later and give that a better read than this very brief introduction. But CARE stands for collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. And so for collective benefit, that means that the data ecosystem is designed and function in ways that enable indigenous people to derive benefit from the data. Their rights and interests in indigenous data must be recognized, so authority to control. In terms of responsibility, those working with indigenous data have a responsibility to share how those data are used to support indigenous people's self-determination and collective benefit, referring back to the previous two principles. And also ethics, indigenous people's rights and well-being should be the primary concern across the data ecosystem. So those are the CARE principles. Then the FAIR principles. FAIR is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And this is a more technical definition. So CARE is more on the community principles, ethics, and more of a social process. Very important. FAIR is also very important, but more of a technical nature / how do you make research outputs available in a manner that they can be reused. And so what that means per principle is that for findable, the data or code needs to have descriptive metadata and a persistent identifier. You usually get that done if you share data or code via a data repository. And via this data repository, you can also make data accessible. So data could be openly available on a data repository, or it could require authentication or authorization procedures. And so this is, for example, the case when there's personal data or data that cannot be publicly shared. Then there's interoperable, where data needs to be integrated with other data and interoperate with applications or workflows. And reusable, for which you need a documentation of the process to understand the data, but also a license. And we can't go into too much detail there, but hopefully if these terms come up, you'll know a bit better what they mean. So in short, be fair and care. And I very much encourage you to check out that website, which we'll also put in the chat at some point. Then, now that we know what we're talking about, hopefully, this will be the overview of the panel. So in a bit, the panelists themselves will do a brief introduction of themselves, and they have about 5 minutes to discuss their open science challenges, their main aspirations regarding open science, and what would their ideal future look like. Then we will go over some prepared questions and statements. But then at the end, we're very much relying on your participation. So please, as already mentioned, put your questions in the Q&A. You can also put it in the chat. The Q&A will probably be a bit easier for us to find it. And hopefully we can get to all of your questions. And then before we move to the panelists, you may have noticed that we have one panelist missing, unfortunately. Dr. Samantha Legitz couldn't make it today due to sick leave, but we would very much encourage you to check out her amazing work. It's a very nice way of sharing the code and the data underlying the research article. So she unfortunately can't be here today, but do reach out to her, check out her work, and get in touch whenever she is back from sick leave. And so we wish her a speedy recovery. And hopefully another point to engage. So we will now move to panel introductions, and we will do that in the order of the slides. So Dr. Crystal Tsosi, will go first, followed by Sean Haukrol, and then followed by Trudy Turner. And I will give the floor to Crystal, and I will stop sharing my slides so you can actually see more.
So yeah, everyone, klechini nashlito na kaidina ebashchin, torchin dashedo tislana dashnana, Dr. Christos Initiate. Thank you all. I just introduced me and Dinek Bazad in the Navajo language. I'm a citizen of the Navajo Nation. I'm also an assistant professor in the School of Life Sciences at Arizona State University in the Center for Biology and Society. I'm also associate director for the Biodiversity Knowledge Integration Center and co-founder of the Native Biodata Consortium, a nonprofit indigenous-led biological and data repository operating within tribal bounds. I'm also a geneticist and also an ethicist. So I approach open data with caution because I see these trends in reemerge in terms of the extraction and appropriation of data and data rights from particularly information that first starts in indigenous lands and peoples. And genomics data also has additional risks on top of other types of data as well. And I usually hate to say that the technology is outpacing ethics, because to be honest, a lot of these foundational ethical questions about gene editing, speciation, and what constitutes normal and what constitutes a reference genome, even these have been long discussed for decades, and in some of the more like philosophical questions centuries, and really now that we have the technology confronting us with the real challenges of incorporating this information. And to scientists who I operate, who ask, why does this matter? Or to quote one of my ex-colleagues, ethics is a waste of time. I have to state that as important as it is for us to keep abreast of the next sequencing platforms, the shift from short read to long read sequencing, and all of these emerging tools, we also have to think about ethics as part of that tool set as well. And we have to be acknowledge that just because something was an ethical norm even 20 years ago or some size decades ago, doesn't mean that those types of standards should continue to be in play today. And especially when we talk about, for instance, ancestors, we also have to acknowledge that sometimes we, as researchers, create data definitions that suit us, but then also don't really make sense in terms of logistical context. So for instance, an ancestor doesn't really know that they have fallen in a place that now might be private land or federal tribal land, or the jurisdiction of their data it does not constitute warranting institutional review board processes because they cannot consent. And that the rights and privileges for their descendants also may not be recognized in the same space. We also have to acknowledge as well that researchers have conflicts of interest when they write data rules that permit them access to data. So for instance, and I've written commentaries about this in Nature, we have major players in the space of biological anthropology who decide to write rules about globally applicable guidelines related to paleogenomics. As a best-selling author, New York Times a person who generates a lot of power, especially considering how few ancient DNA labs there are in the world, that creating rules to permit themselves continued access to this type of data is potentially a conflict of interest, and we have to be cognizant of this when we are conflating perhaps ethics as permission to engage in research, and those processes are not the same. And I also want to call attention to even the UNESCO definition that was thankfully just described, because part of the definition that wasn't in bold was for the benefits of science and society. And unfortunately, that usually leaves out Indigenous peoples. So Indigenous peoples constitute about 3% of the world's population. And when you consider that we are constantly in the minority, and often these terms and phrases about for the benefits of society usually are meant to democratize access to data. It's usually a majority rules types of situation. And I like to poke fun about democracy, especially how it plays out in the American US space, that it should not be used as a synonym for equity, because in this type of system, the minority voices are left out, and that includes Indigenous peoples. I also want to call attention to the importance of benefit sharing, because when we're talking about open data and its the potential benefits, we have to also acknowledge that the innovation pathway related to research and access will unfortunately continue to disenfranchise Indigenous peoples. When we think about 20 years ago, where broad consent was the norm, and people asked individuals to just sign on the dotted lines, permitting them access to data and to permit it to be uploaded in publicly available websites, the first entities to benefit were industries. Industrial partners and for-profit corporations. After that, of course, universities, which in the US are, their right to intellectual property is protected under the Bayh-Dole Act at the Supreme Court level, and Indigenous peoples are often left behind. And if we're returning to that space of open data for all, it really doesn't mean for all, it means for the same actors that have continually benefited. And then to talk about benefits as well, like for instance, in the definition of the Nagoya Protocol, which formulates a requirement for benefit sharing, which by the way is not codified for the Convention of Biological Diversity is not codified by the US, by the way, and other global superpowers. But the exchange means granting access. So that presumes that permission was provided by Indigenous communities to begin with. And unfortunately, in many cases, especially museum collections, that permission wasn't granted by Indigenous peoples who were already their right to existence was already called into question by colonial powers. And in fact, many Indigenous many curators have expressed concerns about making transparent what's in their own collections because they don't want descendant communities to reclaim right to their ancestors because they think it will hinder the pace of progress, which tells you a lot about the value systems and judgments and who's benefiting from the system and who is not. In terms of exchange, if it's to presume that agreement of what defines or constitutes benefit was understood before those biological materials were taken and that actual benefits were received, like that would be okay. But unfortunately, again, and as it relates to Indigenous peoples, it's often non-Indigenous peoples defining what that benefit is. And I'm sorry, UNESCO, you have fallen into that same a definition of exemplifying my case here. And if you are also, as researchers and other entities, promising something like a benefit in exchange for access to data and then never delivering on it, then all of these requisite circumstances fall into a different definition, which is biopiracy. And unfortunately, many spaces in biological anthropology have been called into question by Indigenous peoples and communities since the foundation of the discipline in Western academic spaces as being just that. So when we talk about open data, we want to ensure that we're not just defaulting back to state ethical norms that cause problems to begin with and have reified power structures that disenfranchise Indigenous peoples. And we also want to really be careful that when we are providing these glorified blanket statements that this is going to somehow cause equity in spaces, that we are not overpromising on something that we cannot deliver. Because to be honest, science and the disciplines have done enough of that already. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Crystal, for opening this panel up with the question, open to whom? Very important question. We'll now move to Sean Halko, if you can, please.
Thank you, Crystal. It was great. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, ko Sean Halko toku ingoa. That's me very briefly introducing myself, saying hello to everyone. My name is Sean Halko, and I'm a professor in bioarchaeology, and I also have a research interest in ethics in bioarchaeology and paleopathology. Currently at the University of Otago, and I want to thank very much to the organisers of this session. I'm on the management board for Peer Community in Archaeology. I'm the co-editor-in-chief of Bioarchaeology International, and I'm an associate editor for PLOS ONE. I just wanted to focus on one, and it's probably a rather large challenge, and this is related to one of my main aspirations, is to challenge the multi-billion-dollar publishing companies in the models that they use to make open access publications free for all people who are publishing in them and also obviously readers. And I know that Crystal was just talking about blanket statements about equity, but ultimately I think that this will make science more equitable, both for authors and readers. And in this regard, I just wanted to quickly introduce Peer Community in PCI. This is a non-profit organisation of researchers who often offer peer review, recommendations and publication of scientific articles in open access for free. PCI Archaeology was launched in March of 2020, and Esther is hopefully going to show you a very short video which introduces that if you're interested.
Scientists are revolutionizing the way they communicate their discoveries about our world to the public and to the scientific community. Traditionally, new findings are published in scientific journals. In this process, a manuscript is peer-reviewed to assure accurate and high-quality scientific work. However, this system is too expensive, especially as it relies heavily on scientists working as authors, editors, and reviewers at no cost for the publishers. In addition, the general lack of transparency means that readers cannot evaluate the quality of the peer reviews. Finally, the publication process can take many months, delaying the accessibility of novel findings. To accelerate scientific progress, scientists have started using preprint servers to upload their manuscripts. This allows scientists to establish priority of their discoveries and share their work for free. However, preprints are usually not peer-reviewed, and therefore the scientific community often perceives preprints as fallible and unreliable. To resolve this, a team created Peer Community in PCI, a new and totally free method of scientific dissemination based on recommendation of preprints. A PCI is a group of hundreds of scientists within a scientific discipline, for example, neurobiology, evolutionary biology, chemistry, etc., who evaluate and recommend preprints. By this process, a scientist can deposit a manuscript into an open access preprint server for free. The author can then request a free recommendation of the preprint from the peer community in his field. If a scientist from this PCI reads the preprint and thinks it is particularly interesting, they can become the recommender of this preprint and ensure it is reviewed by 2 or more peer reviewers. The recommender then sends their comments and the peer reviews, including any requested modifications, to the author. The author then updates the manuscript with its improvements or further experiments and deposits a new version to the preprint server. After one or several rounds of peer review, the recommender decides whether to officially recommend the preprint. If so, the recommender writes a short, formal recommendation explaining why the preprint is remarkable and should be read and shared by the rest of the scientific community. Each recommended preprint manuscript is linked to the recommendation, the reviews and comments, all posted on the website of the PCI. This provides transparency to the scientific community and encourages the recommender and the reviewers to make high-quality evaluations. Furthermore, the recommendation itself is considered a scientific contribution and therefore can be separately cited. The recommended preprint can be cited as peer-reviewed. It can also be widely publicized on social networks and media, increasing the visibility of the scientist's work. At this point, the author can submit their work to a traditional scientific journal for publication if they choose. In conclusion, the PCI workflow is an appropriation of the publication process by scientists that is designed to quickly and efficiently provide free access to novel discoveries while transparently and freely assuring the validity and integrity of the scientific process.
Thank you, Sean. Is there any link where people can start with finding out more? There was a link in the video, but if you can share it in the chat so that people can engage with peer community that would be fantastic. And then we move to our final panelist, Dr. Trudy Turner. Please take the floor.
Hi, I guess I'm the establishment where, and I very much appreciate my other panelists' comments in beginning. I'm currently the editor-in-chief of the American Journal of Biological Anthropology. I have been a member of the AABA Executive Committee for many years, and with Connie Mulligan, I chaired their ad hoc committee on data sharing. That was in 2017. We ran an NSF-sponsored workshop on data sharing in 2019 and published some of the statements from that workshop in the journal. We also, the members of the ad hoc committee published a yearbook article on data sharing in 2022. As I actually had a couple of things, a Word document that I would like to bring up for a moment, because my my response to all of this has to do with really publication in the journal. If you could share that Word document. Okay, this is our current, this is just page one of it. There's just 2 pages. This is our, you can find this in the instructions to authors for the journal. And it's our statement on data sharing and data accessibility. And our goal would be to have data shared. And at this point, we ask that all members of anyone publishing in the journal would publish a data availability statement. And we do understand that there are many possibilities for data not to be shared, but if they can be shared, we would like them to be shared. The next page of this shows where we just what is expected, and if you can just get the whole thing up a little bit, just that's fine. We're at the point for, with this Wiley data sharing policies, we are expecting data sharing, which requires us to have a data availability statement, but does not require there to be an actual link to a repository with the data, with the shared data. My goal would be to mandate data sharing for the journal, which would be to, when it can be shared. And we do understand completely that there are many times when data cannot be shared, but there are many times when data can be shared. And we're kind of working in concert with the National Science Foundation that does have data sharing requirements for those individuals who are getting grants from the NSF and from NIH. So there are national requirements for granting, from granting agencies for sharing data, and this would kind of work in concert with what the journal might want. I think that our challenges, are working out the mechanisms for mandating data sharing. I think that we need to look at ways that to operationalize this, and with absolutely listening to communities and working with communities, not listening to, but working with communities to work out ways to make this a possibility, if it can be possible. There are certainly times, but that it might absolutely not be possible. But we're talking about fossil material, we're talking about genetic material, we're talking about primate studies, all of which have very particular requirements and needs. And I think the goal of the journal now would be to work out ways in which we can, what can be shared should be shared. So I guess that's where I am with this. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And thanks all for your wonderful introductions. And that means that we'll move on to the next part of our webinar, which is a response to false statements and misconceptions, for which I will share the screen again, but Björn will take over.
Yeah, so this next segment is meant to be sort of a little game where I will pose some false statements and misconceptions about open science, and then our panelists will try to answer or disprove the false statements. And these are real statements that I have heard in the wilds about practicing open science. So one that I've heard before in person is others in my field don't share the data, so why should I? So we're going to welcome any of our panel members to respond to this statement.
I could if that's all right. I think, in my opinion, that's probably more of a reason to share your data if people in your field aren't sharing. I admit that I myself have not always been as good as I could have been in doing this in the past, and I'm now really challenging myself to do this when appropriate. To me, it means that my findings can be validated, and it allows others to extend this research, and it makes for a more rigorous and verifiable science. And it means ultimately and hopefully that we're communicating more and potentially also collaborating more together. And I was looking online, and there's a good place actually that lists data repositories in PLOS One. They talk about the recommended repositories, and ones that suit different type of data you're dealing with. And I can share that link as well in the chat. That's my 2 cents.
Yep, I think Trudy also has something to say.
Yeah, sorry. I think more and more people are sharing data. And certainly with genetic data, you can't publish it if it's not shared right away. And as I said before, there are requirements now if you're getting federal funding that you share the information from the study. So I think I think it's a culture shift that we're talking about. I think that biological anthropologists are maybe not as good as some fields, but not as bad as others in terms of sharing data. I think there are reluctances to sharing data, and I think those have to be addressed. People get worried about being scooped. People get worried about identification. All of these are things that need to actually be addressed in terms of sharing data. And I think it's our responsibility to kind of to address those concerns. But I think the culture is changing, and I think that more and more people are actually sharing.
Okay, I'll move on to the next one. The publishing open access requires a lot of extra time and money.
It can only give you the perspective of, I mean, of what's going on at AJBA right now. We're a hybrid journal. Some of it is what they call subscription, and some is open access. Open access does require a payment, but Wiley actually has a series of what they call transformational agreements with large entities, either countries or university systems, that reduce the cost to the individual that is publishing. But Shan gave us a great example of a way to not necessarily have to do that. But I think the traditional publishing landscape is shifting, and there's really, and we're in the middle of a transitional time, and I think there's really a shift toward more open access. In the course of like, 2 years ago, 30% of the articles in the AJBA were open access. Last year, 60% of the articles were open access. So there's really kind of a shift toward in publishing itself.
Can I just add something quite small to that? Thank you so much, Trudy. I kind of agree about the changing in landscapes, and I think that as shown, you can publish open access essentially for free. However, some journals are obviously very central to the field, like for obviously American Journal of Biological Anthropology. And while, for example, the University of Otago has this relationship with Wiley, we can publish there. I think a lot of universities don't have that. So that can be a real issue for making papers open access. However, you can make your data free and open access on external servers, even if your paper's not. For Bioarchaeology International, we will be proposing to the publisher, which is the University Press of Florida, which is a non-profit, to make a very reduced open access fee and free for qualifying countries. And our rationale for this, whether it eventuates or not, we don't know, but our rationale is that it would be better to have 5 out of the 10 papers that were open access for the same total amount of income for the journal if 1 out of 10 chose open access at that higher price. But for the journal, it would, still be the same amount of money, same amount of income, and it would make for a more accessible journal and potentially better impact factor through more citations with this open access. So it's, better obviously for the people who are publishing, but I think it's better also for the journals.
Yep, thank you both. Move on to the next one. This
I
is
think
probably one
Crystal
of.
maybe wanted to
Sorry?
say something.
Yeah,
I think
sorry.
Crystal maybe wanted to say something.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I want to be very clear, and actually it dovetails very nicely with this next slide. There are 2 different conversations that I think we need to be careful here. There are 2 different distinctions. One is availability of a published article, and the other one is the availability of accompanying data sets, right?
Yeah.
Because those are 2 different risks.
Mm.
And if we are, and one has a far lower risk than the other. And we should be very careful about making blanket statements of open access, open science, because we are fundamentally talking about different things here. And I also, I don't know if you want to go to your next slide.
Sure.
This available upon request. So I can see how this could be frustrating for researchers, and especially for wanting to increase replicability of data sets. And this is like something that is a challenge, for instance, in the health space related to HIPAA protected data sets, right? But I also want to caution against the other extreme, which is, basically, again, having blanket statements of, well, the mandate is here, therefore we must throw up your hands in the air, and not providing inroads for special considerations as it relates to descendant communities and other vulnerable populations, and make it clear that there are inroads for data, for instance, that have special concerns, and there are options available. For instance, if it has to be deposited because of a data deposition mandate, can it be deposited in community available repositories if they're available? Or can it be available in repositories where there are built-in processes where the community has a little bit more approval in the and build up trust for those types of resources? If there are, and this is something I would advocate for as part of author guidelines, if there are federal policies and certain agencies, many of the big ones, do grant data sharing exemptions. So making that clear to authors that there are other ways and mechanisms for adhering to community concerns, and making them like a roadmap available, I think would help unpack some of these conflations of risks in the space of open publishing versus the deposition of data. And I've got other points, but I'll stop there for now.
No, I think that's, I actually think that's completely doable. And one would not, I think at least for the AABA, one would not go without the other. If we are committed to as open as possible, as closed as necessary. I mean, that's really one of those FAIR principles. And if we would like to be able to work with communities and whatever to work out whatever seems appropriate for publication and for making data available. I think one of the issues is that for us, for me at least, they go hand in hand. You can't have a mandate without having the exceptions to the mandate, because they're just part of the same process.
Yeah, so I agree completely. The idea behind this one is more the when you can make the data available, when there are no restrictions, and you have this statement at the end of your journal article, it's not adhering to the FAIR principles, because there's no clear process of accessing these data. The data don't have to be necessarily open, but there needs to be some clear access guidelines to the data, and that's usually not the email that's included in the journal article, because those disappear. So yeah, another one that I actually hear probably the most is just I don't have time. I don't have time to, prepare my data for sharing. I don't have time to prepare my code for sharing, etc.
I've just got a very short answer to this, is that your data, I mean, depending on what data you're dealing with, but for me, like, your data are all there when you're doing the analysis, and you have them compiled in some sort of assemblage in your database that you use. And they can simply be supplements. So yeah, I don't see an issue with the time factor being an issue.
I think one of the things that we noted was that, especially in the yearbook article, was that, and one of the suggestions is that projects should be planned with the idea of being able to share information. And if it's set up in a way from the start, you may have data in a format that can be shared.
Okay, and we'll jump to the last one. I think we're almost ready to move to the next. Yeah, I often find there's this misconception that if your data are fair, then they have to be open. And even in terms of open science as a whole, there's a misconception that the term open science requires you to have everything open, which is not necessarily the case. So I don't know if anyone has any comments to this misconception.
I think you may have already addressed this perfectly.
Yeah,
in your
partially addressed it.
comments.
No, I mean, so I can finish it off with I think one of the main ideas behind FAIR and open science in general is moving towards a more responsible use of data and of various materials that we use for our research. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be open, but just that we're being more responsible in our, for example, data management, which is an important part of open science, and not just that it's forcing you to have everything open by default.
I actually think that's a real misconception, and I'm glad that you brought it up.
Okay, so we're going to move on to the, I'll stop sharing my screen so that we can see each other. To the, it's late, so the words are not coming to me as easily anymore. The predefined questions that we have for our panelists. And the first one is for those who maybe have joined this webinar to get started on open science and maybe don't know where to begin. So the question is, what advice would you give to attendees wanting to start with open science? I think Shan, you volunteered to answer this question.
Thank you. As noted in the introduction, and also acknowledging some of the issues with UNESCO's framework, they presented what they envisioned a genuinely open science could look like. And there are 4 different areas that they highlighted. One was open scientific knowledge, open dialogue with other knowledge systems, which I think is really important, and I'll talk about soon. Open engagement with societal actors and open science infrastructures. So if we think about open science knowledge, that includes open access publications and open research data, which we talked about before, different things. It also includes open educational resources, open source software, and source code and open hardware. In paleopathology, that's the field that I'm in, and other areas that work with more descriptive type data, open data sharing is sometimes an issue, I find. In recent work published by Mulligan, published in the AABA yearbook in 2022, they show that compared with other subfields in biological anthropology, bioarchaeology and paleopathological data is less often presented in open form. And that may be because of the complexity maybe of presenting macroscopic and microscopic observational data in paleopathology. And some of that isn't necessarily quantifiable necessarily. And another issue that isn't talked about much, but in my opinion is extremely important, is open dialogue with other knowledge systems, including dialogue, and I would argue true transparent collaboration with local communities, including Indigenous communities and local scholars. Related to this, I think what is also especially important in bioarchaeology or anthropology as a whole is to have transparent ethics statements that address that dialogue. For example, in Bioarchaeology International, we now require an ethics statement for every article submitted, so it's transparent how the research was carried out right from the start. Specifically for our journal, it is stated that the research on human remains, contemporary or archaeological, requires, can require institutional permission, official government permits, consent from Indigenous stakeholders, and all permissions from local community members. And we expect that the provenience of the archaeological and anatomical collections are specified in all submitted manuscripts. And we encourage the authors to describe the collaborations, who is given consent, and what other permits or consents were obtained for that research in the acknowledgement section. And we also ask that explicit permissions for the use of photos or other images of human remains are described as well.
I just want to say that we also have instituted a form for a statement on the use of human remains. Mostly it's been implemented with genetic material until now, but all the subfields of biological anthropology have sort of agreed to be using it. So but we've had, we've had long discussions at the editorial board about how the actual form might be modified for different subfields. Like it might be more what might be good for genetics information is not necessarily the same kind of form that might be useful for human remains, or might be. So I think everything is in a kind of, we started this and we're seeing how it goes, and we're willing to make modifications to whatever we have so that we can get the best possible kinds of information for people that we can.
Yeah, and I think that our standards and protocols will be changing over time, so it's kind of like a movable feast, really. Yeah, in addition to there being differences between the subfields. Yeah, I agree.
And the second question that we have is more specifically for the AABA, and what can the AABA do to promote more open and, more importantly, perhaps responsible research?
I think continuing dialogues. I think we've been talking about perhaps running something at the next annual meeting about where we are now in terms of these kinds of the kinds of information we require, where we are now with data access and data sharing. And what I think is important is we kind of move, and I know for the journal this is really important, is we move from kind of these global kind of this is what we would like to do, to the actual more, this is how we're going to do it. And so and what we're going to need for that is input from the community as to the specifics of how we implement these ideas that we have in terms of sharing, because they're going to be different for different parts of the discipline. And we really need, at this point, we really need input, and we're hoping at probably, I've been talking to some people from the human biology association, and maybe something at the next meeting about how to begin to implement this.
This is something that I think is true for all journals that operate in any of the disciplines that I operate, which are a lot. And one is actually really being really careful about stewardship versus ownership, and also being very transparent about what those mean within the context of publication. And I think this is incredibly important, because publication is often, for many entities, the first step as a public declaration of innovation and invention as defined by many worldwide intellectual property organizations. So we really have to be careful about how journals are being utilized in that process, and also allowing flexibility for community input and voices, and also community stewards on behalf of PIs that are also wanting to engender trust with the communities that they continue to work with. For instance, like one of the examples that comes to mind is a journal that or an article that was published now a couple of years ago, where the author indicated, like, I will make the data set available, but not for health purposes, and making that explicitly clear as part of their ethics statement. And then also that if we are going to adopt an ethic of care, all capitals, letters CARE, as opposed to lowercase care, I think we should also be more transparent on how benefits are going to be derived, especially if that's going to be part of the methods generation process. So, for instance, my lab and colleagues are undertaking a scoping review of the scale and extent to which paleogenomicists are engaging or have engaged in community-engaged approaches. And what we're finding is that it's not the fact that researchers aren't engaging in CBPR or community-engaged approaches, but that it's not considered for many of the people publishing to be or maybe as part of a function of the training in those spaces, to be a part of the methods. So simply making the publication also is not requisite as benefit or benefit sharing. For instance, I've heard researchers state that their dedication to community benefit is just making the publication available to the public, and maybe that's not doing enough. So just as like the language of what is ethical or not is moving also to include more substantive benefit sharing, calling for more explicit definitions of how people are defining benefit and benefit sharing as defined in ethics statements could be useful because it could provide more transparency in the processes. It will normalize these practices and hopefully truly improve the science and for all members of society, not just the people that are the usual actors in the space.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Yeah, I think we are good to go for the audience questions. Esther, remind me if I'm wrong.
Yes, we are ready for audience questions, and we already have two, but please do put your questions in the chat or the Q&A because we still have some time left for the panel members to address all of your questions. And so the first question that came in was for Sean, from Nicole Torres de Mayo. And she's saying that PCI is an awesome initiative, and they have loved it since it was created in 2020. However, I see that the workflow strongly relies on the willingness of the community to be recommenders and reviewers. And from traditional journals, we know that it is increasingly difficult to get reviewers who want to participate in the peer review process for free, or just because they do not have the time and energy to do it. Do you see the same happening in PCI? And if so, how does PCI archaeology deal with this?
This is a great question, and I wish I knew an answer to it, but it's getting increasingly hard for all journals or in PCI to get reviewers and recommenders. And I think we start to rely on the same people who are willing to do that, which is also isn't fair for them. For me personally, I probably say yes to far too many reviews, but I do it because I'm really interested in the subject. So I think it's really finding those people who are very well versed with that specific thing that's talked about within the paper. We tend to, for I'm not actually on the end of asking for the reviewers for PCI, but I can talk about Bioarchaeology International. Sometimes we have to ask up to, over 10 reviewers to get two. And that's fair enough. People are busy. I don't know how we'd get past that, apart from recognizing them somehow, and that's hard if you've got a blind reviewing system. So I don't know, maybe Crystal and Trudy have got some ideas as well about reviewers.
I wish. I think getting reviewers is actually probably the hardest thing that we have to deal with. We're also faced with asking, I mean, people are busy. People are, people have a lot on their plates, and this is, what I see a lot is a lot of generosity and grace in reviewers, that they are giving of their time. They're really working very hard, and for the most part are very willing to help out their colleagues in this process. And we do rely on, we can sometimes have to ask 10 people to get 2 reviews. And it's an issue and a problem. And we're always relying on just the good grace of everybody in our community. because in the hope that when one person submits it, that if you're submitting an article, somebody will review it for you. And so that's it's kind of an honor system, but it's a problem.
I can see another question in the question. Can you not see them?
I do not see
Esther?
questions in the
There's a
Q&A
question for
chat, but
everybody. Do you want me to read that out?
yeah, it's in the chat though, so I can see that. I just
Oh,
wanted to
sorry.
check if the Q&A, but if you
Oh,
want to read
I
it
thought
out,
that was
please
the
go ahead.
Q&A. No, I don't need to read it out.
Okay, fair enough. So we have another question from Nicole, this time for everyone. If data are hosted in an external repository that is not part of the journal, what can the journals do to make sure that data are hosted in a long-term period, or at least hosted for the long term, preserved, and so not removed because it's on an external entity? Any thoughts on this?
In the yearbook article, we did provide a list of repositories that we recommended. I think that there are some, for some types of data, that are federally funded. So I guess those will be okay. I don't have any other kind of answer to that question.
I think as long as these data repositories are using DOIs, then there should be some safety mechanisms in place that at least a version of the data set will be accessible. So as long as we make sure that authors are submitting their data to these platforms that actually assign DOIs, and that reviewers and editors check this, I think we're in the same amount of worries of perhaps a journal disappearing in the long term. So I think that would be equally worrying. Let's
Yeah,
see.
to be honest, I have more trust in the repositories remaining active than the journals.
Well, we have a 100-year tradition.
All right. I hope that addresses the question so far. So please do enter your questions either in the Q&A or in the chats. If we do not have audience questions right now, then we'll move to a question that we had, which is, how do the CARE principles and open science practices relate to each other? And I think Sean had thoughts on this. You are muted. We need to have one of those, otherwise it's not a panel.
Sorry, I was on mute. I think the CARE principles, from what I know of them, for Indigenous data governance, are people and purpose orientated. And as you said before, what they stand for, the collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, ethics. And I mean, Crystal has very eloquently talked about this. I think the current movement towards open data alone doesn't always fully engage with Indigenous people's rights and interests. The emphasis on greater data sharing creates a tension for Indigenous peoples who are very rightfully asserting greater control over the application and the use of Indigenous data and Indigenous knowledge for collective benefit. And the CARE principles can complement the existing open access principles outlined by UNESCO's and others that are encouraging open and other data movements to consider both people and purpose in their advocacy and research. But as Crystal pointed out, there are also issues with the UNESCO framework and guiding principles. I mean, it's a very general statement about the issues that I see with it.
Thanks. So Bjorn, you highlighted in an earlier slide that there is already some perhaps questions about fair automatically meaning open. And I think this is also attentive to that. I'll also say that not just we as scientists, I think we as humans, perhaps, or maybe we as scientists, like to over engage in the binary, because if something is one thing, then it automatically must not be this other thing. Indigenous sciences is often pivoted in opposition to Western science, as opposed to acknowledging that no, it's still fundamentally science, knowledge generation, and hypothesis testing. It just has different processes beyond just the fundamental definition of what science is. And I think also care is often pivoted against fair, and then care is then pitted against as in opposition to open. And I don't think that these are proper uses of these approaches. And even Carroll et al., who and collaborators who formulated these set of principles that have now guided these conversations, wrote in later pieces that it's not just one or the other. It's not fair versus care, it's both. And I think if the question is of putting care in opposition to open is the how that question is poised, it's the wrong question. And really we need to be thinking and being more considerate to what are we missing when people have an operational definition of open that doesn't mean they already include these other things. And that's actually the space that I kind of operate in terms of policy and policymakers, who automatically rush and think that open must be open everything, and broad consent everything when consent applies. And everyone must be able to download everything onto the local machines at all and have access to all points of all data at all points of time. And it's like, no. Absolutes don't really work. And I say that absolutely, of course. And we also just have to be really careful about how we are framing these terms and how we are framing our positionality and operating in the space.
Absolutely. Thank you both for answering that question. I see no additional questions in the chat, so we'll move on to another question that we had, which is a little bit contradictory to what we already discussed. It's focusing a bit more on the individual benefits as a scientist. So what are the career or personal benefits of practicing open science? Do we have any thoughts on this?
One of the things, often it does actually increase citation. So having data available can, not just citations, but also collaborations. So these are things that can actually increase. I think, one of the things that came up in the article that we did, the yearbook article, was that people were kind of worried about being scooped. And I think that the actual reality of that doesn't necessarily lay onto or go along with the worry about it. And it's not, it's, we have to make some sort of a, what about people who have access to the data anyway? Your collaborators or other kinds of things. I think that's not been the major issue. I think the benefits of collaborations and citations kind of has proven to be much greater than the actual downsides of it.
That's a wonderful highlight of how open science can indeed be a benefit to us personally. I'm also heavily biased because I think I have my current position thanks to open science practices. I don't think they would have hired me if I had not demonstrated some capability of doing open science practices in the role of a data steward. So just wanted to highlight that there's also additional roles where these practices are actually very much appreciated and maybe even required to transfer into these types of careers. Do we have additional thoughts on this question? If not, I also have a different question. Who else can we learn from in terms of open science? Are there organizations and individuals outside of the field of open science that we should be looking towards? And I think, Crystal, you already highlighted some of this, but if you want to highlight some more, or of course, any of the other panelists, if you have any thoughts on other individuals, organizations, other fields. We discussed other fields. We're not doing that bad compared to other fields. But which field is doing better? Where from who can we learn?
There's, I'm not going to get it right, but there's an organization, I think there's a group out of the University of Michigan, I think, that does political science and sociology and other kinds of, I'd have to look up the exact name, but I think they've dealt with certain questions about consent and other things that I don't think we have to reinvent the wheel completely. I think that there are other organizations that have actually, they've dealt with long-term field studies. So the ecologists have dealt with long-term field studies. We could learn from them about what they do. This group out of the name of which is, I'm sorry, I don't have right now, but they've dealt with human groups and how to deal with confidentiality and others. So I think if we look to some of these others, we might be able to, we don't have to do it all. We don't have to do a lot of it over again, but there are certain things that are specific to biological anthropology and to our knowledge base that we would have to do independently, but not everything.
The true spirit of open science, reusing already existing practices, I suppose. Additional thoughts on this?
There's an organization called Local Context that is focused on generating data practices around metadata labeling. It results first out of the space of museum curations and museum collections, asking a simple question. What is the provenance of some of the artifacts and data types being held in collections? Where does it come from? And if communities are associated with those type of data, then what are the community practices, norms, preferences related to use of that information? So there are, of course, different types of labels, biocultural labels, traditional knowledge labels, and it's meant to track with through this larger linking of databases together to enable that sort of harmonization of across different data sets. And I think that's something to really think about, is attaching, thinking more thoughtfully about attaching community preferences and provenance onto the data that we're utilizing, because there's an emerging conversation that related to legacy data and residual samples in, like, for instance, the biomedical space but really, like, what happens to when data was collected before an identifiable descendant community had permissions in place, like before tribal research review boards were enacted. And then now there's tribal governance practices and new ethical standards in place. Which data practices do we utilize? The original or the newer forms, right? And this is incredible conversation that's also fraught as it relates to some potential existing practices and norms related to, well, it's already consented. We shouldn't have to re-ask. And as the methods and technologies, especially like in my space sequencing, become more potentially invasive on the re-identifiability of individuals and communities, it's a conversation that we all have to have. So that's a space that I'm looking at for this type of work.
Thanks so much for sharing. Sean, did you maybe have any thoughts there? Or you're happy to pass this one?
I'm okay. Yeah.
Fair enough. So before we move to our final statements of our panelists, because I don't see any questions in the chat, I would just like to state that this has been a lot to unpack, probably for at least for me. We discussed open science. We went over fair and care, how all of this relates. I'm starting to doubt whether we should still call it open science, because it's making us all very confused about what should be open and not. And open means maybe everything, and that is definitely not the case. So how should we rename it? Which is maybe a bigger question that we all should consider. But I definitely want to just highlight from there that indeed, by just having blanket statements and moving towards everything open, even if that's not the intention of open science, we're moving further away from the goal, which is indeed benefits for all members of society. So the question, open to whom, and who is involved in research and what are we doing it for, should be at the forefront, I think, moving us forward in open science. I don't want to steal the final floor, so we'll go to all of the panelists who will have about 2 minutes to come up with a final statement with anything that they want to close the panel with. And we'll move to Trudy first this time.
Okay, I very much appreciate this conversation, and I look forward to a continuing dialogue in beginning to operationalize some of this material. I think that we have to find a way to have these things work together, to have the idea of access and openness work with the with respect and our obligation to work with populations. And I think that we can do this, but I think we need to think about this and think about how to operationalize it. And it's not going to be as fast as I would like, but I think that if we begin the conversation, we can make progress. Thank you.
Thank you. And we're now moving to Crystal.
So I just ask, whose ethics are being prioritized? Whose harms are being addressed? Who's defining those rules? Who's benefiting? And if it's all the same entity, then we're doing something fundamentally incorrect and we need to reassess. And we just have to be acknowledge like our space of positionality and privilege, especially if we want to do better by the science and the processes and really ensure that it's going to be a benefit to everyone who historically has not benefited. Thank you.
Thank you for circling back to also your opening, your introduction. Sean.
I think we in journals need to think outside the box in publishing in this very challenging capitalist environment where Elsevier and Wiley are literally making billions of dollars. And the challenging the economic system in which our journals and even non-profit journals work and exist to make science inherently, well, they work to make it inaccessible for many, and therefore contribute more to this inequitable science system. And I think that preprints and open data repositories are at least a small option for getting around that. And that's not a criticism at all to the American Journal of Biological Anthropology or any other journals. It's just the nature of this capitalist environment that we're all working in. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for bringing capitalism in at the very end, which is a root cause of many of our problems. I would now like to, on that note, move to Björn for some wrap-up and closing statements. And let me know if you need me to share the screen, because I think I fixed my issue.
Yeah, great. That would be if you can share the screen so I can see what I'm actually saying.
Yes.
Yeah, so some quick resources for those who are looking to get started in open science. The Turing Way is a great place to start. And I know you can often become overwhelmed by the number of resources out there for open science, but yeah, Turing Way has got a lot of it covered, and it's a great place to start. There are also communities who are involved in various aspects of open science. So I mentioned the archaeology community, some shameless self-promotion, which is a community of people who use or who want to use the R programming software for their analyses. There's the Open Phytoliths community as well, and the SPAM community, which is community in ancient metagenomics. Again, not directly related to open science, but they do have a lot of this community-based events and various accessible materials, and they're working towards making metagenomic data more fair. Yeah, and I would like to thank the panel for joining. It's been great to hear all the different views on open science. So we have from the more traditional journals and trying to enforce open science policies within traditional journals, but then also these alternatives that, in my opinion, are the future of academic publishing, these preprint peer review systems. And then, of course, talking about stewardship in open science, and something, yeah, we heard a lot during this webinar, I think, is community. And I think what sort of the spirit of open science is, which is not really very well captured in the term, which we have also, as Esther mentioned, is that we're sort of reclaiming science and reclaiming knowledge, and whether it's the scientific community that's reclaiming it from the big publishers, or whether it's the community that are reclaiming it from the traditional university setting, there's this movement towards community, which is, I think, is a big part of open science, and that the community should be the drivers of these policies and infrastructures. And it's also about just being more transparent in general. It doesn't mean you have to share everything, but you just have to be more transparent in the process. And that'll help, I think, regain the trust from the public and from the communities. And it's something that the current system just doesn't do. So, and I think our panel really captured that very well. And then there's one final mandatory slide that we have to mention for the upcoming AABA dates and deadlines. I don't think there's a the next webinar is planned yet, but there'll be updates as soon as that's known. The deadline to volunteer to join the program committee for the 2025 annual meeting in Baltimore is July 1st. And then there are proposals due for invited symposia at that meeting, which the submission opens July 15th and closes on August 15th. And yeah, with that, I'd like to thank everyone for joining, and hopefully we'll be hearing a lot more about open science in the future. As Srini mentioned, I think the culture is changing slowly, but it is happening.
Thank you all. Take care.